are a few simple things that can save your life, like avoiding creepy places at night, locking your front door, and never toying with curses. Unfortunately, curiosity often wins over common sense, and by then, there's no turning back. In the heart of a quiet, unassuming town lay a secret most had forgotten, an old subway tunnel sealed off decades ago after a series of unexplained disappearances. Over the years, it faded into legend, a local curiosity whispered about around campfires but rarely spoken of seriously. That is, until one morning, when the entrance mysteriously reopened. The rusted metal gates, once chained shut, now hung ajar, their heavy links broken as if by an immense force. No one claimed responsibility for unsealing it. The town council denied involvement, the construction crews hadn't been hired, and no city project had been announced. Yet there it was, a gaping maw leading into darkness. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed to have seen faint lights deep within the tunnel. Others swore they'd heard whispers or screams late at night. The bravest, or most foolish, locals ventured inside, armed with flashlights and bravado. None returned. The tunnel's sinister reputation only grew, but for a group of bored teenagers, it was impossible to resist. Lena, Matt, Jason, and Claire were inseparable friends, always on the lookout for thrills. Urban exploration had become their latest obsession. The reopened tunnel seemed like the perfect challenge, a chance to prove their courage. "It's just an old subway," Matt said as they gathered supplies in Lena's garage. "It's probably nothing." "But what about the people who disappeared?" Claire asked, her nervousness barely hidden. "Probably just got lost," Jason shrugged, checking the batteries in his flashlight. "That's why we've got this." He unfolded an old map of the subway system, yellowed and brittle. "We'll be in and out before anyone knows we're gone." Lena, the most daring of the group, smirked. "Come on, Claire. What's the worst that could happen?" They set out at dusk, walking the overgrown path to the tunnel's entrance. The air grew colder as they approached, and an unnatural stillness settled over them. Even the crickets seemed to stop chirping as they stood before the open gates. "Ready?" Lena asked, her voice echoing in the silence. The others nodded hesitantly, and they stepped inside. The tunnel swallowed them whole. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang. Their flashlights illuminated crumbling walls lined with graffiti and old posters peeling at the edges. It smelled of mildew and decay, the scent growing stronger the deeper they went. "This isn't so bad," Matt said, his voice too loud in the oppressive quiet. But as they ventured further, the atmosphere shifted. The tunnel felt alive. Faint vibrations hummed through the walls, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse ever so slightly. The light from their flashlights seemed weaker, barely piercing the growing darkness. "Wait," Jason said, stopping abruptly. "This isn't right." "What do you mean?" Lena asked, frowning. Jason held up the map, shining his flashlight over it. "There's no fork in the path here." Sure enough, the tunnel had split into two paths, neither of which were marked on the map. "That's weird," Matt muttered. "It's an old map," Lena reasoned. "Maybe they added some extensions?" "Or maybe we shouldn't be here," Claire whispered, glancing nervously down the darker of the two paths. Ignoring her, the group chose the left tunnel and pressed on. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with every step. The oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The map was useless now, and panic began to set in. "We're going in circles," Matt said, his voice trembling. "I swear we passed this same graffiti earlier." "No," Lena insisted, though she didn't sound convinced. "We just need to keep going." As they argued, Claire froze. "Do you hear that?" They all stopped, straining to listen. Faint, shuffling footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. "Someone's here," Lena said, her voice wavering. "Maybe it's one of the people who disappeared." "Or something else," Claire muttered. The footsteps quickened, and the group bolted, running blindly through the twisting tunnels. Their flashlights swung wildly, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls. The footsteps followed, relentless and unyielding. Suddenly, the tunnel seemed to shift beneath their feet. Matt stumbled and fell, his flashlight skittering across the floor. "Help me!" he shouted, but the others were too far ahead. Matt scrambled to his feet, only to find himself face to face with a pair of glowing eyes. They hung in the darkness, unblinking and inhuman. "You don't belong here," a raspy voice hissed. Matt screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the tunnel. The others didn't notice Matt was missing until they reached a massive, open chamber. It was unlike anything they'd seen before. The walls were lined with strange, pulsating symbols that seemed to move under their gaze. "What is this place?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason stepped forward, shining his flashlight on the symbols. "I don't think this is part of the subway system." Before they could react, the walls began to shift again, grinding against each other like the gears of a massive machine. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air filled with a low, guttural hum. "Run!" Lena shouted, but it was too late. The walls closed in, separating them one by one. Lena found herself alone in a narrow corridor, the air suffocatingly thick. She turned a corner and froze. A tall, impossibly thin figure stood before her, its limbs twisted and elongated. It had no face, yet she felt its gaze pierce through her. "Leave," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. She turned to run, but the floor gave way beneath her feet, and she plunged into darkness. By sunrise, the tunnel entrance was sealed once more, as though it had never reopened. The town moved on, its whispers of the old subway fading back into obscurity. But deep beneath the surface, the tunnels waited, shifting and reshaping for the next curious souls to venture inside. In the sleepy town of Ravens Hollow, life moved at a peaceful, predictable pace. Its residents cherished the quiet isolation, the way the mist settled over the hills in the mornings, and the comforting routine of knowing everyone's face. But there was one thing the townsfolk didn't talk about, a ritual they all acknowledged silently. At the stroke of midnight, the bell of the old church on the hill would toll, piercing the stillness with its mournful cry. No one dared to climb the hill to investigate. The church had been abandoned for decades, its bell tower left to rot and sway in the wind. The bell wasn't just an eerie curiosity. It carried a grim reputation. The locals believed that every time it rang, it foretold a death. The pattern was undeniable. A toll at midnight, and by morning, someone in the town would be found dead. Yet, despite the warnings, no one could explain who or what rang the bell. When journalist Maxine Carter moved to Ravens Hollow, she was ready to leave the chaos of big city life behind. Burned out from a high-stakes career investigating corruption, she sought peace in the quiet town. But peace was elusive when curiosity tugged at her every night as the bell echoed through her walls. At first, Maxine thought it was merely a legend, the kind of story small towns spin to keep outsiders entertained. But when Mr. Hensley, the town butcher, was found lifeless in his shop the morning after the bell rang, she started to reconsider. Her neighbors spoke in whispers, casting nervous glances toward the hill. "They say the bell tolls for the next to die," said Clara, the elderly librarian, as she handed Maxine a stack of books about local history. Clara's eyes were clouded with worry. "You'd best leave it alone." Maxine's instincts as a journalist kicked in. She couldn't leave it alone. She dove into the town's archives, piecing together fragments of the church's dark history. In its heyday, it had been the center of the community, led by a charismatic but secretive pastor named Father Alcott. But rumors of dark rituals, missing congregants, and a chilling scandal involving Alcott's disappearance had tarnished its legacy. The more Maxine learned, the more determined she became. Who was ringing the bell, and why? One cold, moonlit night, Maxine decided to find out. Armed with her trusty recorder and a flashlight, she climbed the overgrown path to the church. The air grew colder with each step, as if the very ground resisted her intrusion. By the time she reached the rotting wooden doors, an unnatural stillness had settled over the hill. Inside, the church was a hollowed-out shell of its former self. Broken pews lay scattered across the dusty floor, and shards of stained glass cast fractured moonlight onto the walls. The bell rope hung limply in the corner, untouched. Midnight approached, and the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. When the first toll rang out, Maxine froze. The sound reverberated through the church, shaking the walls. She looked up at the bell tower, her flashlight trembling in her hand. That's when she saw it. A shadowy figure silhouetted against the bell. The rope moved in perfect rhythm with the tolling, but the figure seemed unnaturally still. Gathering every ounce of courage, Maxine climbed the narrow staircase to the tower. Each creak of the wood beneath her feet felt like a scream in the silence. When she reached the top, she found it empty. The bell swung on its own, moved by an unseen force. Scratched into the metal was a single phrase: "Death comes at midnight." Her heart raced as she backed away. But the nightmare wasn't over. That night, as she tried to sleep, the bell rang again, this time closer, as if the sound had followed her home. She woke to find her recorder playing by itself, capturing faint whispers that chilled her to the bone. "Maxine, it's time." The following day, she confronted Sheriff Blake, demanding answers. But the sheriff, a grizzled man who had lived in Ravens Hollow his entire life, only shook his head. "You should have left it alone," he muttered. "The bell chooses, and it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." Maxine refused to give up. She spent hours interviewing terrified locals, piecing together the bell's deadly pattern. It didn't just warn of death, it marked the next victim. And now, all signs pointed to her. That night, as midnight approached, Maxine sat in her living room, every light blazing. The bell tolled, louder than ever, and a shadow moved outside her window. Her phone buzzed with a new message, a photo of her standing in the church tower, staring at the bell. Panic surged as she heard footsteps in the hall. She fled to the sheriff's office, but when she arrived, the building was dark and deserted. The bell tolled again, deafeningly loud, and Maxine realized too late that there was no escape. The next morning, her body was found at the base of the church's bell tower. Her recorder lay beside her, still running. The final recording captured the toll of the bell and a single chilling whisper: "Welcome home." The bell continues to ring each night, its mournful sound echoing through Ravens Hollow. The townsfolk know the pattern well, but they don't speak of it. They only wait, dreading the day the bell tolls for them. The air was sharp with the bite of winter when Mark first noticed the figure. He had been tending to his property, inspecting his crops and fences, when his eyes were drawn to his neighbor's field. It was a wide stretch of dry farmland, mostly barren now, save for the lifeless stalks of corn swaying in the breeze. There, standing like a sentry under the overcast sky, was a scarecrow. It wasn't there the day before. Mark frowned as he set down his tools and stared. The figure was tall, hunched, with its arms spread in an unnatural way. It wore old, faded clothes stitched with patches, and its straw hair stuck out at odd angles. Something about it felt off. He could almost swear it wasn't just a figure of straw and cloth. He shook his head, trying to dismiss his unease. "Must be my imagination," he whispered, returning to his work. But as the days passed, the scarecrow became more of a presence. It stayed in the neighbor's field during the day, but at night Mark would find it in different spots, closer and closer to the edge of his property. Always in the shadows, standing at the boundary between the fields, unmoving, as though it were watching. The movements were imperceptible at first, a step, maybe two, in the dead of night when the wind shifted. a whispery creak of straw against the cold air. Mark began to lose sleep, waking at odd hours to glance out his window, only to find the figure there, still, waiting, staring. The first night it truly became real for him was when he saw it move. It was just past midnight. Mark had been tossing and turning in his bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching him. He swore he could feel eyes boring into him from the direction of the neighbor's field. Against his better judgment, he rose from his bed and peeked out the window. His heart dropped. The scarecrow was no longer standing by the line of dry corn. It was at the very edge of his property, near his porch. Mark could see the dark outlines of its arms, swinging slightly in the wind, as though it were reaching toward his house. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he stared, unable to tear his eyes away. He thought about going outside to confront it but froze, knowing how stupid that would be. He locked the window and drew the curtains tight, trying to convince himself that it was simply a trick of the wind, that his mind was playing games with him. But the sight lingered, etched into his mind like a terrible photograph. By the time he confronted his neighbor, the scarecrow was mere yards from his back porch. Mark knocked on the door of Mr. Graves's modest farmhouse at dusk, his breath fogging in the crisp air. The neighbor came to the door, wrapped in a thick coat and holding a steaming mug of coffee. He was a gaunt, bony man, his face weathered by years of hard farming. His expression was friendly at first, but it shifted slightly as he saw Mark's face. "Is everything all right, Mark?" Mr. Graves asked, his voice calm but wary. "I've got to ask you something," Mark said, his voice tight. "That scarecrow, the one in your field, it wasn't there before. I swear it appeared overnight, and now it's getting too close." Mr. Graves stared at him, puzzled. "Scarecrow?" "I haven't put up a scarecrow in years, Mark. No one's touched that field in months." Mark blinked. "What do you mean?" "It's been there. I've seen it, right by the property line every night. I don't know how it got there, but I swear it keeps moving closer." Mr. Graves's brow furrowed, and for a moment Mark thought he saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear? Or maybe it was just exhaustion. "I promise you I haven't touched a scarecrow. Not in years." Before Mark could respond, the wind picked up, and the sound of rustling straw reached their ears. They both turned to look at the field behind them. The sun was sinking low, casting streaks of orange light across the snowless earth. And there, at the very edge of the property line, standing against the wind, was the scarecrow. It wasn't in the same spot as before. It was closer. Mark's heart pounded. "What in the hell?" Mr. Graves took a step back, his voice hesitant now. "That's impossible. It must just be the wind playing tricks." Before he could finish his thought, Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, heart pounding, and his hands trembled as he looked at the text that had appeared on the screen. "Look out your window." Mark's blood turned ice cold as he stared at the message. His breath came in shallow gasps as the reality of the words sank in. His body moved instinctively, his hand gripping the phone as he turned toward his house. But before he could move, Mr. Graves's face fell. He looked past Mark, his eyes locking on something behind him. Mark turned, just in time. The scarecrow was standing at his window. It wasn't in the field anymore. Somehow, it had moved. Its hollow eyes were fixed on him, piercing, unblinking. Its arms were stretched out, claw-like, and the shadows of its body pressed against the glass, as though it were trying to force its way inside. Mark could see the ragged fabric of its coat swaying, the straw reaching out like a skeletal hand. He froze, his throat closing as his body screamed at him to run. The wind howled outside, and the sound of the straw brushing against the window was deafening. Mark stumbled backward, gasping, but before he could slam the window shut, the figure seemed to move again. It was alive. It had to be alive. Mr. Graves was standing behind him now, frozen as well. His face was pale as he looked at the scarecrow. "What the hell is that?" Mark breathed. Mr. Graves looked back at him, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not supposed to move." Mark could barely think. His hands were shaking as he pressed his palm against the window. The scarecrow continued to stare, unblinking, and a sudden cold washed over him. He could feel it, deep, icy, and suffocating. He sprinted back from the window, locking the door behind him. His breaths came in fast, his mind racing. He grabbed his phone again and looked out the window as if he could still see it, but the scarecrow was gone. But he knew it was still there. And the worst part was that it was watching. He could feel its gaze, even if it was hidden. It lingered in the shadows, in the wind, in the corner of his mind. It would come back. Mark knew it would. And it wouldn't stop until it had him.